This week is Parashas Tetzaveh, and of course it's Parashas-Zachor, the mitzvah to read about the attack of Amalek in advance of Purim, which is next week is Rosh Hashanah, and since next Sunday, Monday will be Purim itself, so this parsha will deal with the parsha, or this shir will deal with the parsha and Parashas-Zachor and Purim itself to some degree. And even though after finding out this last week that doing a search in Google turned up a site that actually used my website as one of their proofs of the validity of the protocols of the elders of Zion, which was somewhat of a surprise. But of course, if a person wants to use things in their own particular way, and especially anti-Semites, I guess it's not such a surprise. And I guess in some respects, I thought twice about dressing like this, specifically with the hat and the tie. In advance of Purim, just to get in the frame of reference, the frame of mind for the Chag that's coming up, because this will probably just be used as some type of proof by some person that the Jews want to control all the money in the world, that in spite of the fact that we work hard for what we have, and for the most part we mind our own business and we try to do that which helps mankind in general, that people turn it against us for jealousy, whatever reasons. It's an age-old issue going back to Amalek going back in history. Amalek, as we said before, crossed 7 borders and went out of his way to attack the Jewish people, in spite of the fact that they weren't even on the mandate, they weren't even on the agenda of attack in terms of taking Canaan as the land as God promised and God commanded that we should do. Nevertheless, when anti-Semites look for a reason to hate something or somebody, the Jewish people will always be the reason for it, or the cause of it because of jealousy, but primarily because anti-Semitism is not racism. Anti-Semitism is a form of communication that God uses to talk to the Jewish people when in fact that we don't listen to the nicer and softer messages, just like children who are told by their parents over and over again in order to be able to get them to do what they have to do, and they of course ignore it because there's no threat at that point in time. And later on when you finally get frustrated and tell a child, get moving and do what you have to do, and the child says, you hate me, you're always yelling at me, you're always commanding me, because of course that's all they listen to, that's all they hear at that point in time. They ignore all the previous warnings. So the Jewish people also, Kodesh Baruch Hu is constantly talking to us, constantly giving us warnings and signs of what he's thinking, what he wants to do. And we don't listen because it's not threatening. Because at that time, Kodesh Baruch Hu was saying, would you guys mind, just like moving on and maybe coming back home to Eretz Yisrael, or maybe doing the following mitzvah, or maybe not getting so involved in the Gentile ways? And we say, not now, just a moment. We'll deal with it later on. And of course, time goes on, and Kodesh Baruch Hu waits. He's Bal Rachamim, he's Bal Savlanut, he's patient, but everything has a limit. History has its moments, its ketim, its finite moments, and we have to make certain changes by certain times. And if we don't do it, eventually anti-Semitism comes along later on to say that time is run out. So it's never going to be logical, and for that reason, anti-Semitism historically has tended to be the most vociferous, the most vicious in places where the Jewish people were the most assimilated. Racism, for the most part, depends upon differences of language, differences of appearance, differences of dressing. But interesting enough, that in places where the Jewish people had the highest profile, in other words, they're most different, for example, Hasidim, eventually it affects everybody on all levels if it goes to extremes, like in the Holocaust, but it begins and tends to be the most vicious in places where the Jewish people were the most like the Gentile population to this very day. And it's because it's not logical, because it's not racism. Anti-Semitism, as the Gemara says, comes from Sinai. Anti-Semitism is God's way of saying time has run out, the clock is ticking, we got to the end, you have to make the changes, keep moving, it's time to make those changes and finally move on. Anyhow, normally, let me just take off the hat for the time being, because the parsha, the point that I'd like to make is pretty serious, and it's a very important point, tied to Purim very much. And normally I don't read from my own notes, because I don't like to read from my own notes, I don't like reading from notes itself, but in this case there's some very, very important points that I'd rather not miss. So I'm going to use this as the basis for the shir itself. And it's based upon the pasuk where the Torah in this week's Parashas says that we should make garments, clothing for Aaron the Kohen Gadol, and the lashon is lechvod tiferet, that is for the sake of glory and the sake of beauty, splendor. That's what the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is all about, and really, for that matter, what the Jewish people are all about. Anyhow, so as it is well known, Moshe Rabbeinu was born and died on the 7th of Adar, 120 years to the day, indeed to the moment. Because as the Gemara points out, tzaddikim, they live precisely to the very last moment they can possibly live. They fulfill their life right down to the last second. Haman knew that fact and chose the day to exterminate the Jewish people of his time on that day, right? Assuming that it was good muzzle for him and bad muzzle for the Jewish people. He found it the hard way that he had it backwards, because just like Moshe Rabbeinu died on that day, he was also born on that day. So it's almost an example once again of how the refuah comes before the makkah, because Baruch Hu will always create the remedy in advance of the illness, because by the Jewish people everything is for tikkun. So Moshe being born on that day, in a sense, is the refuah. It's the trufa, it's the medicine in advance of the fact he died on that day, so therefore it becomes the source of Haman's undoing as well. At first thought, there seems to be little, if any, direct connection between the holiday of Purim and Moshe Rabbeinu. Indeed, the phrase, right, when Adar comes in, the Gemara says you're supposed to increase simcha, seems to have little to do with the greatest prophet who ever lived, right, hence the tie, right, prophet, right, seemingly a very serious man who, when it came to the will of God, was all business. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu, Eved Hashem, all business. Unlike the rest of us, Simcha did not have to be on his radar, so loyal was he to God, Torah, and the Jewish people. Personally, I need Simcha to get out of bed in the morning, right? We have to enjoy what we're doing. We have to have a reason to live. But Moshe Rabbeinu, it wasn't like that. Moshe Rabbeinu, he was just completely Eved Hashem, Meshubat HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So not true. Indeed, there was a tremendous connection between Moshe Rabbeinu, Purim, and Simcha, and if this is not obvious to a person, it wasn't to me at first as well, for that matter, then he has to reconsider his definition of Simcha. Societies rise and fall in definitions. And not only this, the connection is so sublime that it not only emanates out from the above verse in this week's Parsha, but the Kohen Gadol, the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, it also explains why, in a more positive sense, Moshe Rabbeinu is not mentioned anywhere in this week's Parsha, as everyone always points out. And why? Because after the sin of the golden calf in Parashas Kisisa, the next week's Parsha to this one, right? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to exterminate the Jewish people, wipe them away because of the terrible sin that they've done, or at least the sin they didn't stop from happening. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't do that. Have rachamim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, yeah, we'll start all over again with you. And Moshe says, if you're not going to forgive the Jewish people, then erase me from your Torah. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'll erase who I want to erase, right? But since you've said something, somewhere your name is going to have to be erased, taken out, not put in. And that's this week's Parsha, right? So why would that be the case? If Moshe was being chutzpahdik, if Moshe was being selfish, is one thing. But Moshe is standing up on behalf of Klal Yisrael. So why should his name be erased? He said, please tolerate their sin, and if not, remove me from your book, which you have written. In fact, contrary to popular belief that the exclusion of Moshe Rabbeinu's name from this week's Parsha means something negative, ultimately it is the biggest compliment God could give to Moshe Rabbeinu, alluded to by the following verse in Parashas Balosecha. Moshe was very humble, more than anyone else on the face of the earth. But, more importantly, in this verse, and through the life of Moshe Rabbeinu, we can unlock the very secrets of the most important commodity in life, simcha. That's what it's all about. It's all about simcha. Trillions of dollars and trillions of hours have already been spent trying to find a way to harness it, by the Western world for sure, but to little, if no avail at all. So few people have ever really achieved it, like love. One of these things that people think they have, they don't understand, but it's much deeper, much more complicated, but simcha for sure. while most people simply settle for artificial forms of it, right?